This video covers how you fill in a lab notebook. That is to say that when you're doing your experiment, you'll be recording your data by hand in a lab notebook as you go along. And this video is going to explain to you how you do that. Now, this page that you're looking at right now, and the ones that come after it, are all from a handout that I've put on the Moodle website. So you can go back and look at those at your leisure. So before I start telling you about what goes into your lab notebook, I'm first going to talk a little bit about the idea of permanence. Because a scientist's notebook is supposed to be a permanent record of all of their work, it's considered a legal document, it's admissible in a court of law, but in order for that to be true, there's some things we need you to do in order to make it a permanent record of everything you did. So the first is you must write in ink, so no pencil and no ink that can be erased, permanent ink. Second, never tear out pages from your notebook. Again, it's supposed to be a permanent record of everything you did. And if you make an error, just cross it out with a single horizontal line and write the correction nearby. So don't use whiteout and don't scribble something out to the point where it can't be read, because then you're removing information from your lab book. So let me show you what a correction should look like. So let's say that you've written down this value in your lab book and you realize that you need to correct it. So you cross out the value with a single line and then you write the correction nearby. And the point here is that both the error and the correction are completely readable still. If you do need to change an item of data, it's also always a good idea to write down why you changed it. You don't need to do that if you're just correcting something that you miswrote, but if you're changing data specifically, then write down why you decided to change it. Coming back here, another thing that you should never do is write on a piece of scrap paper with the intention of then copying it neatly into your notebook later. Everything should go directly in your notebook, including rough work. So if you do want to do some rough work, put it on the back of a page, label it as rough work. Your lab instructor can ignore it when they're marking it, but it should go directly in the lab book as a permanent part of your record. And finally, messy is okay. It's all right if you've got things X'd out, arrows, comments in the corners. Your book doesn't have to look perfect. Only the science matters. So just make sure that it's readable and complete. It's okay if it's messy. So now let's talk about the things that you do put into your lab notebook. And by the way, I'm going to be showing you a handwritten example of a lab notebook in a moment. So the first thing that should go in your lab notebook is the identifying information. So you turn to the top of a fresh page and you write down the experiment title, the date, your name, and your partner's name if you have a partner. Next, you would write the objective. Now, most of the experiments have an objective in the lab manual, and it's okay for you to just copy that. So if the lab manual didn't have an objective, it would be acceptable for you to read through the experiment and to come up with a couple of sentences explaining what you're attempting to do with that week's experiment. But like I said, most of the time the lab manual will have an objective that you can copy into your lab notebook. After the objective, you write your Apparatus Procedure section. Normally for this, all you need to do is refer to the lab manual. So in the example they give here, they say, please see the Physics 1101-1120 lab manual for such and such an experiment. And usually that's all you need to write in your Apparatus Procedure section. The exception to that would be if you used a different method or a different piece of equipment than what's in the lab manual, in which case you'd describe that also in your Apparatus Procedure section. The next thing that goes into your lab notebook is your data and observations. So this is where you would write down all of the values that you measured. When you write down a single item of data, you want to include all of this information. So first of all, write down a written description of what the variable is and its symbol. Then you want to write down the measurement and its uncertainty and its unit. And then somewhere close by, you should write down an explanation for why you chose the uncertainty that you did. So here's an example of that. You've got the quantity name, the symbol, the value, its uncertainty. Every value that you write down should have an uncertainty with it, and the units. And then underneath, they write the uncertainty estimate. And note here that at a bare minimum, you need to say what type of uncertainty it is, reading uncertainty, physical uncertainty, or instrument uncertainty. And you need to say what it's from, the ruler or the roughness of the block or some other factor. And more information is always better than less information, so here they've written down 2 times 1/4 millimeter for reading both ends of the ruler, rather than just listing the total reading uncertainty of the ruler. When you have related or repeated trials, you should put your data in a data table. Put an informative title on it, and if you've got more than one table, you should number it as well. And notice in the column headings, we have all the same information we had for a single item of data. So we've got a written description of the variable, we've got the symbol, we've got the uncertainty, and we've got the units. So everything we had before is now in the column heading. And near the table, we also write down the uncertainty estimate. So we explain completely why we chose the uncertainties that we did. One thing I'll add to this is that if you have an uncertainty that's a percentage, like for example, you had a photo gate and its uncertainty was 1%, it's completely acceptable for you to put that percentage, 1%, in the column heading, instead of an absolute uncertainty that has units. And finally, in this course, you're going to be doing your calculations in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you'll hand that in, and that's what your lab instructor grades. So you don't need to put a calculation section in your lab notebook, it's optional. But remember that all your work is supposed to be done directly in the lab notebook, including rough work. So if you do want to work something out by hand, say an uncertainty calculation, then put a calculation section in your notebook and do your work there. It won't be graded. It's just to keep all your work together in the lab notebook. So here's a written example of a lab notebook. They start by putting down the experiment title, the date, their name, and their partner's name. Next, they write the objective for the experiment, which can be copied out of the lab manual. After that, they put the Apparatus Procedure section, and for that, generally speaking, you just need to refer to the lab manual. And finally, they have their data. So it's completely labeled with units and uncertainties, and underneath their data, they have fully explained all of their uncertainty choices. So they explained how they got all of those uncertainty estimates. So your lab write-up should look roughly like this when you're done.